Light Yagami lost. Whether you think Light deserved to win or whether he deserved to lose. Whether you think Light's defeat was justified or if it was just a plot contrivance. What if, instead of losing, Kira won against Nier and continued his reign? Let's first discuss how Light could have found a way out of that situation with SBK as well as Nier, with how afterwards Light would have executed his promise of creating a new world that is free of crime, leading humanity to a different era with him ruling over everyone else now that both L, Nier and Mello were all gone. But before that, sub up and help me get the 30k this month and join the Discord server to get a chance to talk with me. Firstly, to begin with, was it possible for Light to have won in the situation he was in by the end of the series, with SBK as well as Nier? The answer is, without a doubt, yes. The biggest mistake Light made during the entire situation, or rather, even before that, was that he had gotten far too arrogant after he had defeated L with his memory loss plan, convincing himself that at this point, there wouldn't be anyone left to threaten his existence after him, meaning that his reign will be uncontested until the end. It's often a complaint that people feel cheated that Light lost because of a mistake Mikami made rather than his own error, or how the SBK was able to copy all the names in the fake Death Note in an impossible time frame. But even beyond that, I feel that many oversee the fact that it is also because Light's lack of foresight regarding Mikami making any mistake, as well as assuming that he'd be able to carry out everything perfectly using indirect methods to communicate information between them, which of course just ends with Light with his pants down when his plan fails, with absolutely zero room for any contingency to save him if the plan fails. Light has a lot of ways he could have killed Nier if he wanted to through the powers of the Death Note, even without a name, whether that be via forcing the death through Kira cultists to show up at the warehouse to kill the SBK and Nier, leaving himself alive in the aftermath. But of course, someone like Light doing this has a negative possibility, considering it will fall upon his pride that he wasn't capable enough to find a way to outsmart Nier without needing to fall upon his influence as Kira. Nier's entire plan very much depended on knowing that Light wanted to try something at the warehouse, his big plan to be able to kill him and the SBK. But we do actually have an easy solution or counter to this that Light could have used against Nier, by refusing to play along. If there's no Mikami's presence, then there's not really going to be any evidence that could frame Light in a situation like this to begin with. And if Light just makes sure that the meeting goes in any way that was not according to Nier's anticipation, then it would be a successful tactic. A possible example is to say that Mikami could have looked into the warehouse and, according to the plan, just ran away, instead of deciding to confront everything right there in the warehouse, written the names later on, realizing that it was a fake notebook and then used any remaining pieces that could have been Light's. Or even Light himself could later write the names, since Light will now have the SBK and Nier's faces and names to kill them, all with the Death Note pieces later on. I won't stretch this segment anymore, but if you have any more ideas on how you think Light could have won, feel free to comment on them. From here, we will be assuming that this is how things end up and continue the scenario from this situation. Now let's see, what exactly would Light have done after he had won? I think an interesting thing Light would most likely try to do would be to create a successor for the next Kira after he presumably dies after the Nier incident. But I don't really believe he's gonna find someone, considering how connected his motivation is towards Light Yagami being the god of this new world, rather than someone else who takes on his mantle after his own death. And I find it unlikely to believe that Light would be able to find someone that fits the role to his impossible ideal of who Kira is supposed to be. Light's plan would also impact someone that is here at this very moment. You. I'm talking to you, the person who is watching this video. There's a chance to become one of the people Kira kills in a Death Note as you're snacking on anything while watching a video about this. For those unaware, Kira eventually planned to use a Death Note not only on just criminals, but expanding the use of it to people who did not contribute effectively towards society, to act as a motive for the others to work harder so that they could collectively work towards improving the world itself. He only considered that Mikami was doing it far too early in his own eyes. So it's possible that not even you could be free from the hands of Kira, even if you don't commit any crimes. Now, to the more, or rather the most important question. Will under Kira's reign, crime, war, and any criminal activity stop, or perhaps reduce themselves to the point that they are no longer relevant? The answer is pretty obvious in my opinion, and not up to debate at all. Absolutely not. No matter what Kira or Light tries to do, without a doubt, crime will not stop, and the utopia he sought will never be possible as long as humanity persists until our extinction. Punishments for our wrongdoings have been ingrained in for thousands of years now. Depending on the level of sin you have committed, will cast you a punishment that is equally as worthy to repay the karma you have accumulated across your lifetime. But despite this, people still committed sin. They still committed wrongdoings because not even the fear of God was something that could stop them. Even the people in power, especially in religious institutions themselves, could be a product of this, where despite supposedly being people most close to God, they still practice things that went against the God they cherished, and spend their lifetimes worshipping to give themselves and others a purpose to attach themselves to. The fear of God punishing you for doing something wrong is not at all something that the human condition will just accept and stop doing what is wrong under their own eyes. As long as even a single one of us is breathing, we're all people who can commit sin, as long as it serves our own incentives until the very moment life leaves our bodies. Crime would never be the same, now that we had a quote-unquote God exercising his power by controlling what crimes could and could not be done. But in spite of that, it is a certainty that despite this, crime would still persist, even if it meant persisting in the shadows outside of Kira's eyes. Light wants an utopia that is simple. And I mean it when I say that is simply not possible, considering the human condition itself has shown that, when concerned with similar levels of quote-unquote restrictions what they can do, they would still find a way in the end. Light's idea of justice, after all, since the beginning, has always and never developed past being a naive, funny idea of how he thinks human could develop under his rule, when in reality, that will never be the case. Kira had quote-unquote become the same as the law in this new world, but the law is always going to be fighting an uphill battle against those who try to find ways around it. And there'll always be people who find ways around the system, and even Kira is not excluded from that simple idea. Crime itself would have to adapt itself to what Kira needs to prevent it. It's hard to ascertain what exactly it would be, but nonetheless, crime, whether that is petty or even crimes that concern global levels of wealth, power, and many more things, would have to be done under the idea that Kira is watching them. Global crime rate reduction on paper is still a possibility, but I believe it will majorly be because crime detection itself would adapt to improve to hide itself from Kira's wrath. Things like war, while being kept on a standstill because of Kira, sounds like a good thing. I can't imagine it will last for much longer considering human nature, similar to crimes. I believe that the way of fighting wars between nations would have to change to protect themselves. War and crime have become an inherent part of identity as civilization the further we have gone. And as long as our circumstances as a civilization does not change to a completely unpredictable one, I do not believe they will just vanish as Light wants them under his vision of a perfect world where everything is under his control. I do not believe that even as time passes, Light will change his views on humanity at all. Even his own death was not able to force Light to change him at all. It just revealed to us who he truly was at his core in the manga. A pathetic serial killer who had convinced himself he was God, which would most definitely leave Light with an imperfect world. L, Ni, and Mello might be done, but who is to say that Light does not get a new challenger in any point of future, even if unaffiliated with the previous people who challenged him? The longer Kira tries to restrict the people, the more the frustration will grow as they feel an increasing desire to rebel against Kira's rule, with there being more incentives to catch Kira's identity, with there being a large amount of hunts for him on the internet, as well as in real life, to try to trace him to anything they possibly could. Would it really be that unlikely someone out there, not far from the intelligence of the two, would seek out Kira, knowing that he was not a god, but rather a pathetic serial killer just like the rest of them, and a Kira whose ego has grown dimensions and dimensions from his victory against L, Ni, and Mello, would additionally likely be even more sloppy than Light was in the ending of Death Note Part 2. I believe it's very much a possibility, since I can't with reasonable mind say that society will not adapt to Kira. Corruption and all types of crime will never stop, and because of that, I believe that it's really not that unlikely Kira gets caught with the appearance of anyone with even slightly relative intelligence to L or Ni. Now, let's ignore everything I've said in the past few minutes and try to think what would happen if somehow Light did manage to do everything he wanted to do, somehow achieving a perfection of society itself, with there being no future geniuses to challenge him, and he eventually gets in a position with there no longer being any threat, action, or much aside from his role as Kira of clearing out the rotten world. If then, how would Kira's story end? Surprising as it may be, I don't really think if the quote-unquote perfect scenario happened, then Light's end would be different from what it was either of the anime or the manga. Light would achieve everything he wanted, his quote-unquote perfect society. And then what? I believe Light would become stuck with the original problem he had in the series, and the beginning of why he became Kira in the first place: boredom. Without anyone to challenge him, no more loose ends, and an increasing perfect control over everything he does, it will be boring. Light was a model student who basically had everything you could imagine in life. He was from a wealthy background. He was academically gifted and would have gotten no problem with easily getting married and living a far higher quality life than 90% of the world besides him. But even with this, Light was still bored. Boredom was his sickness, and Light would likely succumb to it once more when he reaches the top of the world in the scenario. Light has everything he should have wanted, but still remains unsatisfied because that is a human condition we are all a victim of. Something cool like Light writing his own name in the Death Note is not an impossible outcome, considering I do believe it's hard to say how a Light who has spent decades upon decades doing this singular thing will develop his mindset. But I believe a more interesting outcome is something we see in the Death Note musical. In the musical, the second part of Death Note doesn't exist at all, and after Light beats L, Luke eventually finds Light's behavior and patterns tedious. And as a result, he just kills Light because of the sickness known as boredom. And I would rather the intelligent crowd that seems to come in the comment section not talk about how that is completely not like Light and a dumb idea, half of which is true because it's a Light who's much older and hence much a different person than the current fairly young and naive adult he was. Going back to the more realistic perspective by not ignoring what I just talked about beforehand, I believe if Light had found a way to win in the end, it still wouldn't result in a proper victory, because his naive perspective on society would never be fulfilled, as Kira cannot create an impossible version of society, no matter how much he desires and tries to do with the rules he creates and restrictions he puts on humanity, and would eventually fail in one way or another, whether that involves him being caught, which I believe is highly possible at one point if he gets egotistical enough to lose to someone. Maybe his next challenger O will be the one to take him out, who knows. Most likely he'd die in a similar way to the original manga ending, where he has his name written in the Death Note by Luke as his cause of death. So Light would still meet the same end he did, with just the difference of winning against Nier, failing to create his own society even when there was supposedly nobody left to oppose him anymore, and end up dying anytime later than his original time of death in his mid-20s.